Welcome to another webinar from the PEN Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. My name is Nasan Mahboubi, the director of the project, and today we continue our 6-week rollout of the publications and associated findings and recommendations from our third cohort of project fellows. In these 6 weeks, you will hear from each of the thematic groups of our third cohort fellows right up until the end of March, when, of course, we know that President Trump is reported to be traveling to Beijing for a much-anticipated summit with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. In today's program, you'll be hearing from our human rights, law, and democracy fellows in this program that we have titled Values, Competition, and Convergence in U.S.-China Relations, which reflects the 3 very interesting and provocative papers that you will hear presented today. These are all working draft papers, which you can find published on our website. The purpose of these webinars at this stage of our process is to give our fellows a chance to share them with the wider public, get some feedback from people on the webinar and people who watch outside, and then take that feedback and put that into the final versions of their papers, which we will publish as a collective volume of all the third cohort fellows later this spring. I should mention as well that we are currently in the process of recruiting applicants for our 4th cohort of project fellows. You will see the call for applications on our website. The application deadline is March 17th, and we hope that we will not only get a lot of great applicants, but that you will watch these webinars to get a sense of the kind of work that you would be asked to produce in the course of this year-long fellowship. Without further ado, let me invite today's speakers to come up on stage so I can introduce them and we can get today's conversation going. I'm delighted that the moderator for today's program will be my colleague, Dr. Amy Gadsden, the Associate Vice Provost for Global Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania, and the third cohort fellows who will be presenting their working draft papers in this discussion. I'll start with Elizabeth Donkervoort, who is a director of the China Strategic Risks Institute. We also have Carl Minzner, who's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as a professor at Fordham Law School, and Jake Werner, the director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute. Thank you all so much for being part of this program. I'm so excited to hear this discussion. And with that, I'm going to log off and hand it over to Amy.
Nason, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you who are joining us for this webinar that's titled Values, Competition, and Convergence in U.S.-China Relations. As Nason said, there probably was a time not so long ago when we might have just titled this panel Human Rights in China. But that has changed. For 35 years, there was a fairly consistent consensus that human rights mattered in U.S.-China policy, with a change, beginning about 8-9 years ago, that we needed to take China as it is, not for as what we wished it to be. That has taken the wind out of the sails to some extent and created headwinds for those who are thinking about how to promote human rights in China. Into that space, our 3 paper writers today, our 3 speakers, have moved forward very compellingly, drafting 3 really excellent papers that chart a new course, maybe, in thinking about these issues and diverging, perhaps, in some ways from how we might have thought about them in the past. And I'm very excited to talk to them today, have them share their papers, and have a discussion between us around sort of what the future of thinking about human rights in the U.S.-China relationship looks like. So I'm going to ask each of the drafters to speak briefly about their papers, introduce kind of the main themes and recommendations, and also ask them how they came to their topics. What was it that brought them to these issues in the first place? Why did they think they are a priority? And then we'll have a discussion from there. So I'd love to first invite Elizabeth to talk to us about her work thinking about transnational repression at the state and local level.
Thank you, Amy. And I just want to thank the PEN Project for this opportunity. It's been a really enriching year So as you mentioned, my paper is focusing on how subnational actors navigate that gray space when legitimate public diplomacy evolves into or is blended with tactics of foreign interference or transnational repression. And I'm looking at it in the context of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, because it is assessed as the largest perpetrator of foreign interference, as well as transnational repression, not only in the United States, but also Canada, and a large perpetrator in other countries, including Australia, UK, and also the EU. I was drawn to this topic for deeply personal reasons. I have a background working on human rights and with human rights defenders, and so I do know personally many victims of foreign interference and transnational repression. And I'm also a recovering lawyer, and my practice previously was in municipal law, so the subnational level has always been front and center in the work that I've done. So, taking a step back to my paper, how are subnational actors navigating this space? Well, not very well. For starters, they are not trained foreign affairs experts, and they do not have the deep awareness or even a cursory understanding of the People's Republic of China that is necessary to counter these sort of tactics and to navigate this space. Second, there's no federal policy related to China. It's very ad hoc and fragmented, making it very difficult to navigate bilateral relationships. There's no national definition or universal definition of what foreign interference is. Again, making it very difficult for actors to navigate this space, to identify it in their communities. And the laws that do exist, such as the Foreign Agents Registry Act, or the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, have ever-evolving entity lists that make it very complicated when trying to comply with them. And so this is an already complicated space with very limited resources to support subnational actors. Previously, they relied on just a handful of civil society organizations, as well as the subnational diplomacy unit within the State Department. Over the last 14 months, we've seen significant cuts to all of these areas, limiting the access to resources, as well. The subnational diplomacy unit has been dissolved, making it even harder to identify who the touch point at the State Department would be when engaging in subnational diplomacy. This can be contrasted with the People's Republic of China in their foreign affairs outreach. Subnational diplomacy and subnational outreach is a core principle of that, and there are considerable resources underlying that, not only financial, but also technical, supporting outreach at the local level. And it's also undergirded by a very comprehensive and sophisticated surveillance mechanism, which has some interrelationships with foreign interference, which I discuss in my paper. It's also highly coordinated by United Front Working Group. And so we see this real imbalance and asymmetries in knowledge for local actors in the United States as compared to their counterparts in the People's Republic of China. We also see that, in my paper, I detail significantly, I take a considerable amount of time detailing the tactics and the targets that are deployed by the PRC in its foreign interference operations. And these have been developed and refined over decades of sort of repression and manipulation that have taken place domestically within the PRC. But what we see from this is it's highly contextual. And so it's really community-based how these tactics will unfold and who they will be targeting. And this, of course, can be very overwhelming for local.
Interjecting here for a second, Elizabeth.
Yep.
What are those tactics?
They can run the full gamut. So I outline it on a spectrum. So if we're starting at the furthest end of illegitimate tactics, it's transnational repression. And we unfortunately had a very real case of this week. There was a Hong Kong rights activist based in the United States, and her father was just imprisoned for 8 months for his connections with her. So we see this sort of repression by proxy of families. We see harassment happening on the ground in the United States, whether it's by PRC officials or their proxies. But then we also see narrative manipulation. So astroturfing, which is fake grassroots online behavior to demonstrate or to show that something is actually what the people want, but it's not. It's all just through fake Twitter accounts and whatnot. So it can really run the full gamut. There's also examples of bribery, for money or other things, including roasted duck. So those are kind of the things that we're looking at.
And let me interject for a second again. So recommendations, what are some of the recommendations you come to in your conclusions?
So my first recommendation is to put more resources back into supporting the federal government should put more resources back into supporting local actors as they're in their subnational diplomacy, and also to start identifying different elements of foreign interference in their communities. But then the bulk of my recommendations look at, well, how can communities proactively be doing this? And what I outline is a risk analysis process whereby they do a mapping of the actual vulnerabilities that exist within the context of their community, and then do an assessment of whether or not those vulnerabilities are being exploited or leveraged for interference purposes, and what would the likely impact of those leveraging or exploitations be. And this is to help them prioritize where they should be putting their resources in terms of combating foreign interference. And now this may sound like a big ask, but localities are already undertaking emergency management plans whereby they're doing analysis and mapping of vulnerabilities within their community on a whole range of different types of threats, whether it's terrorism or erupting volcanoes. And so really it would just be a matter of tweaking these existing mechanisms to integrate foreign interference as an actual risk facing communities.
I saw that in your paper, and I want to ask you about that as we move through the webinar. But now I want to turn to Carl Minzner and some of the work that he has been focused on with regard to pronatalism in China, demography issues, and this might be an interesting kind of convergence and competition discussion, because the headline in the New York Times today is all about America's declining birth rates and how policies and politicians are responding to that. So Carl, over to you.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a thing. So thanks both to Amy and to Nathan and for putting the event together, for having me as a fellow for this year, and for organizing the event. And thanks to all the other folks from the other fellows who traveled. We traveled together to Beijing, to DC. It was a very interesting set of conversations. Just like Amy mentioned, my focus, big picture issue that I've gotten very interested in is demographic change, and the particularly in China, but throughout East Asia, precisely because I think this is kind of the next level question. This is like the next set of, everyone talks about current politics, everyone talks about economics, but if you're really looking for them towards the middle of the 21st century, this is the new set of challenges that will begin to affect China, begin to create all sorts of changes as the youth population basically just goes away, and you get a very large number of elderly population increases. So this is the subject of a book that I'm publishing next year, and the working paper that I'm doing today, or that I did for the Penn project, is really about China's pivot towards pronatalism. Because China, just like the rest of East Asia, at some point wakes up and discovers, oh, wait a minute, this is going to become, demographics are going to be problematic for us going forward. And just like Japan in the 1990s, South Korea and Taiwan in the early 2000s, China over the last decade or so has begun to sort of move its policy, once synonymous with the one-child policy, has moved towards pronatalism. So the one-child policy was scrapped in 2016 for a two-child policy, then moved towards a three-child policy in 2021. 2021 is the date at which Chinese authorities themselves begin to sort of promulgate sort of clear pronatalist slate of measures, policy instructions that then get rolled out over the subsequent years. Many of these include things that are, of course, tried elsewhere in Europe, also throughout East Asia: childcare subsidies, extended parental leave, direct cash bonuses for family with children. And many of these are actually have very laudable elements, sort of aimed at addressing financial and practical barriers that sort of prevent or deter prospective parents from having the number of children that they themselves desire. But as with similar efforts throughout East Asia, these actually haven't had the effect that authorities want. Marriages in China, just like the rest of East Asia, are cratering, so too births. And there's a longer story behind this, but basically one key thing is you've got very complex gender dynamics that are going on between young men and young women. Naturally, there are other elements too shared around the world, housing costs and the like, but it really is important to realize that there is a gender dynamic at the core of what's taking place, where gender relations are becoming antagonistic, and young people, both young men and women, are sort of being driven away from marriage and from relationships. And again, just as Amy mentioned, some of these trends you see in the United States as well. So our question is, well, what's the policy recommendations? And my core one is that I think first, these are deep internal issues that will really be driven by actors within China themselves. But the United States, I do think it is important to have a consistent policy framework, a consistent narrative and themes in terms of how we talk about this, not just for China or not just but also for us at home. And I think it's really useful to distinguish between what is like, legitimate good state support for families and, helping people realize their own fertility intentions, helping them have the desired number of children that they want, and inappropriate ones, which would be sort of government intrusion into reproductive autonomy, where you try to coerce or promote people to have a particular set of children. And that last bit is what I'm a little bit worried about right now in China, because if you start looking at some of the dynamics, you can start to see that the population planning apparatus within the last 4 years is now beginning to sort of contact young women about encouraging them to have children. I've had discussions with young women who have been on the receiving call side of those calls. You're starting to see sort of entire museums, National Museum of Women in China, being politically rectified. Propaganda narratives are being shifted to present one particular form of family, multifamily children, women playing a special role with respect to raising children. And that's beginning to be coming through the state ideological narrative. And I'm a little worried about where that could go. I mean, there are other developments I could talk about in terms of divorce approval ratings in courts coming down, not solely because of we want you to have children, but there's just a new neo-traditionalist narrative that's starting to go through the system. And so I'm worried about what this could lead to in the long term. And I think having a consistent narrative and line that the United States, not just government, but civil society, the way we talk about these things, both for ourselves, but also in China, I think are useful. The second point that I also like to try to make is that I think at the end of the day, if you're trying to discuss these issues with Chinese authorities, I think it is also really important not just to rely on normative frameworks, but just to point out the practical consequences. Right now, South Korea's it is almost at the very bottom of worldwide fertility, the decline in fertility. They're at like 0.8 right now in terms of fertility rates. And part of that is because the gender dynamics between young men and women have become really skewed as things have become polarized. And I think one quite likely potential, if China ran through a very coercive, highly politicized narrative about what should be done, is I think China's fertility rates and marriage and birth rates could drop down to South Korea. And I think that's a point that people in Beijing, authorities in Beijing, would pay attention to. I'll stop there because you may have more questions.
Yeah, there's a really interesting question here about the state's relationship to women, whether it was under a one-child policy or now a 3-child or more policy. And also, I would note an interesting through line between your work and Elizabeth's work is this, kind of spectrum of legitimate behavior, legitimate government action, legitimate government policy, tipping into something that is more coercive or nefarious, right? And trying to sort of understand that difference and maybe, approach those things, understanding that it is on a spectrum. But before we get to that, I want to bring in Jake Werner. I'm going to do a little bit of cross marketing here. So on Monday, Jake, I am going to be moderating a panel at Perry Worldhouse here at the University of Pennsylvania with the former Swedish Foreign Minister, Margot Wallström. The title of that panel is Between Hope and Despair. And I raise that because your paper and the conversation that you bring to this discussion, really takes us, I think, from despair to hope in powerful ways. And so I invite you to talk a little bit about what you've been working on with regard to, a redefinition of public goods and how the U.S. and China might work together in a brave new world.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's great to hear. I'm really interested to see how your panel comes out and kind of how that panel manages this transition, because what you're right, the sort of landscape that we're looking at right now is just almost seems like pure despair. If we're talking about my topic is about global public goods, but if we're talking about almost anything in the topic of human rights, democracy, law, with regard to China, with regard to the United States, with regard to the world as a whole, it just seems like, what is the basis for even trying to talk about these things? Everything is going in the wrong direction. all the systems that sort of institutionalize these things or preserve some kind of norms around these things, they seem to be being torn down, often with a lot of exuberance. So like in the most relevant example to my topic is the Trump administration's destruction of US aid last year under Elon Musk, but then institutionalized after he left the administration. And that was, you all hear me? I'm seeing the picture is frozen.
Yeah, your camera has frozen, but I can still hear you. Now let's pause a little bit. Maybe Jake will come back online. So Carl and Elizabeth, let's continue the discussion, right? So how do you navigate between what is legitimate government activity, whether it's promoting culture and goodwill in the case of, people-to-people relations and some of the subnational diplomacy things that you're looking at, Elizabeth, or Carl, in your case, the government's responsibility maybe to think about, its role in promoting healthy relationships between men and women, healthy policies around child having and child rearing, and something that tips into something more negative.
I mean, I can go first, and the pithy answer is very carefully. But really, what it comes down to is having knowledge and awareness, and the knowledge and awareness not only of your community, but also the risks that it faces and the leverage that it has, and then coming forward with the confidence to be able to enforce the red lines that you establish. So in my paper, I do talk about several instances where local communities, have pushed back, whether they're being told to talk about Taiwan in a specific way, or whether they're being told to have a development project in a community that they really don't want. These communities, stood firm, used their democratic institutions to say no, and it didn't undermine the relationship. I think there's a lot of fear that if you say no, then the PRC counterpart will just walk away, but that's not always the case. And I see Jake is back.
Jake is back, but hold on, we're gonna finish this line of conversation, then we'll come to Jake. So would you say, Elizabeth, that it's not a matter of resistance to this kind of education and work at the local level as much as it is ignorance? I mean, is it really just a matter of helping local communities and local governments to understand how to navigate these issues, or do you see, or are you concerned that there's resistance?
Well, I wouldn't use the term ignorance. What it really is an overstretched capacity and overwhelming of local officials. They're not being provided the resources and the knowledges that they need. We talked a lot about this actually across all of the cohorts, is this shrinking pipeline of China experts and siloing of China expertise into specific industry sectors, whether it's finance, whether it's climate, and not having that sort of holistic understanding. Where we do see resistance is where there isn't that holistic understanding. Politicized rhetoric comes in, whether it's anti-China or whether it's anti-Western, and that's where you see resistance to engaging with communities holistically and with the empathy that's needed. And that puts marginalized and vulnerable communities at even heightened risk because they just become political pawns.
All right, Jake, we have you back. We're glad you're here. So you were talking about the sort of exuberance with which AID was dismantled in the last year, and keep going from there.
Yes, sorry about that. So I think even if we look at the kind of the most enthusiastic destruction of basic humanitarian aid in the Trump administration, that's not enough. It's not a wide enough picture, because the same thing is happening not in such a obvious way, not in a way that is self-promoting, but the same thing is happening in most of the other rich countries that are cutting their aid programs or are directing them towards areas of geopolitical interest. For Europe, a lot of that is moving aid to Ukraine. So that leaves the rest of the world in a very precarious situation. And already, I think the starting point here, I think we need to recognize that the aid system already did not adequately ensure the provision of global public goods. And what I'm talking about here is things like clean water, sewer systems, basic access to electricity, to core public health, education, transportation, telecommunications, these things that people in the rich countries, they just take for granted. It's the basis of our societies. It's how we have exchange between people in our societies. It's the foundation of everything we do. And much of the world can't enjoy that. For example, about 3.5 billion people do not have access to safe sanitation. And that leads to the death, and this is before the destruction of existing aid programs. Over 1 million people a year died from diseases related to poor sanitation. So the old system was not acceptable by any means, and we have the attempt through the UN system to raise the level of provision of these goods through the Sustainable Development Goals. Many of those, and many of the most important ones, are far short of the aim of achieving those goals by 2030. So this raises the question then, like, why are we talking about this? The US and China can barely get along in a civil fashion to start with. The entire world, even the supposed humanitarians in Europe, are pulling down the old aid system. And so if you'll bear with me just for a second, I want to talk about kind of the framing that I give in the paper to try to think through some of these things. Because I'm trained as a historian, and even though I focus on policy now, I always start my thinking about policy always starts from considering where we're at kind of in a larger historical trajectory and what that means for what kinds of policies would make sense. And part of what I'm doing in the paper is trying to get a handle on that around this issue of public goods and the humanitarian aid system. So that old approach that I said was really remarkably inadequate even before it was destroyed, that was sort of a charity-based model. If you were suffering lack of access to these basic needs, if you could somehow get a rich person to feel sorry for you, or if you could appeal to a rich country government that saw geopolitical advantage or economic advantage from helping you, then you might be able to have these needs met, but otherwise probably not. So there was sort of a systematic inadequacy of a charity-based system. And the analysis I do in the paper is that charity-based system comes out of a deeper structure of the global order. So many of us will know this as globalization, but I think we need to be specific about what kind of globalization, because there are many different conceivable forms of global integration. This one was a market-led, privatizing, individualist, and highly unequal form of global integration. And the form of humanitarian aid that made sense within that system is the one that left millions of people exposed to deadly illnesses every year. And I think it's also worth flagging that the form of human rights, the form of democracy, and the form of law that thrived for about 3 decades, starting in the 80s, all of those forms were specific and they integrated into the system. But that system is collapsing. Since starting with the 2008 global financial crisis, and through the rise of bottom-up populisms and top-down, the sort of intensification of top-down predation, people have thrown out these old ideologies of how we could all get along. And increasingly, people and countries are speaking as if the only way that we can survive is if we dominate others and we pillage, we take from them what we need. And some people are getting there reluctantly and other people are getting there enthusiastically, but everyone seems to be moving in that direction. And the sort of basis of the argument that I'm making here is, and this is where the US-China relationship comes in, because I imagine those of us who follow US-China very closely will see that these dynamics are core to the collapse of the US-China relationship as well. The sense that there was previously in the globalization system, there was this sense that our interests were aligned, that if we got closer, we would be richer, that we would all end up in the same place. There was this convergence towards liberal democracy and free markets. And both sides have now ripped up that understanding. Both sides have turned against free market capitalism, have turned against liberal democracy. And I think that understanding that means that we're in the midst of a crisis. A crisis is something that opens up opportunity as well as destroys what was there before. And the possibility I'm raising is that we could look towards, so not today, not for the next 3 years, probably, but let's look just beyond that and say that the global system is likely to be in even more dire straits at that point than it is today. The existing institutions, as degraded as they are now, will be even further destroyed. It's not just the humanitarian aid system after all. It's all the basis for international exchange and discourse and the ways that we coordinate our lives as a world. All of that is being thrown into question. And there is going to be a need on the other side of this for a reconstruction period. The question is, what is the new system going to look like? I think this is true broadly. What does the new US-China relationship look like? What does the new form of human rights look like? And what does the new global public goods system look like? The argument I make in the paper is that to get us out of this crisis, it's not just a nice thing to have, but it would contribute to getting us out of the crisis to pursue a much more intentionally public-oriented public goods provision. So not based on charity, not based on if you can't get it through the market, then it's not really a public good, which is the way that these things are often understood, have often been understood in recent decades, but just a sort of straightforward core commitment that the public will provide these goods and we will do so around the world. And then that poses the question, what would that system look like? And I think the US-China relationship would be crucial to defining a system that might be workable.
All right, we're going to follow up on that, but I'm going to go historian to historian with you and say that the basis for the rapprochement between the U.S. and China was a security consideration, not an economic one initially, although it does become an economic one pretty quickly within 10 years. Okay. So Jake and Carl, one of the things I think that both of your papers raise in my mind is a question of who are the people in China who share your views on these things? I mean, are there communities within China that are, considering the questions you're asking, both very different questions, but considering the questions you're asking and coming to similar conclusions or developing similar kind of, analysis and recommendations kind of broadly conceived? Do those groups exist, and what do they look like?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a crack on that. So yeah, I mean, the question of right now is a very interesting time to start thinking about this sort of demographic issue in China, because I do think this is something where there's still some level of flux in terms of like what's going on. In 2021, when Chinese authorities adopted their pronatalist pivot, at least the official stuff, it still is really very much couched in the language of supporting people to realize their own goals. It's sort of fertility supportive policies. Of course, behind the scenes, you've got a couple of other things going. You also have sort of this general pivot towards neo-traditionalism as sort of an ideological grounding. So, the invocations of Confucianism, traditional culture, that goes back, over 10 years. That's been sort of a core part of the Xi era. There has not as yet been anything like what happened, say, with the one-child policy in around 1980, where you began to reduce everything to specific numerical targets. That's the thing I'm really worried about. I'm worried about at the point where the demographic crisis narrative takes over and somebody decides they need to bake in specific numerical goals with respect to fertility targets into the cadre evaluation, the evaluation systems for party cadres. I think that would unlock a whole range of bad things. We're not quite there yet. It's like you can see the bureaucratic apparatus, you can see the ideological stuff begin to pivot. Politburo is 24 men, no women. So the whole system is sort of starting to go in a particular direction, but you can hear within sort of think tanks, you can hear within, whatever feminist circles still exist, like there are some issues associated with this. And so part of what I'm doing is I'm just trying to also echo things that you hear in China itself. And you can actually hear Chinese women and others and think tank officials sort of say, yeah, we made some big mistakes with the one-child policy. We shouldn't replicate those in reverse. And so that's kind of, what you're doing is you're asking me, like, is this echoing anything that's going on in China? And you're absolutely correct. And if it's entertaining, I was just reading a RAND report that was issued in 2025, where they're looking at the Chinese policies, and they're the RAND, a US think tank, and they're like, based on what's going on in China, we shouldn't. We've got to maintain the same principle of, individuals have reproductive autonomy and we want to encourage people and support their own decisions. I thought it was interesting to see, that the Americans looking at China and saying, maybe there's stuff there that we should draw lessons from, perhaps in a negative or for our own benefit at home.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating. Again, that idea of convergence in some of these issues that we're seeing. Jake, how about you? Is there a constituency in China that is, articulating a vision for, a new framework for development and global collaboration or cooperation along the lines of what you're talking about?
No, not along the lines of what I'm talking about, but what I'm looking for is some potential that could develop in that direction, if the United States really moved in that direction. And I think the potential is there on the Chinese side. So the provision of global public goods has been a very strong feature of Chinese international rhetoric for some time. What they mean when they say that is not what I'm talking about. What they mean when they say that is we're going to support more connectivity, and this is a connectivity of a range of types, from trade to telecommunications to sort of bringing electricity to more people. Much of the overseas development finance that China pursued in huge quantities in the 2010s, but has dropped off significantly since then. And it was in the 2010s this really significant increase in Chinese lending that drove the panic in Washington about the Belt and Road Initiative. But much of that aid went into building basic infrastructure that is a precondition for the provision of these basic needs that I'm talking about. And the reason for that is not because Chinese leaders are great humanitarians or they're altruistic. The reason is because it works for Chinese political economy, because there was a huge surplus of productive capacity in infrastructure building sectors, and China was looking for a way to employ that surplus, to employ its enormous currency reserves, as well as to improve its global standing, and that the Belt and Road is basically an expression of those drives. So these things.
I'm glad you raised Belt and Road because, certainly when I was reading your paper, that was the note in the margin, right? There was a moment in the 2000s when you had the United States kind of putting forward, the Millennium Challenge Corporation and this focus on development tied to governance and improvements in governance. And, China initiating Belt and Road and its, emphasis on infrastructure development. And there's a world in which you could see that those were complementary, right? What the US does well in development is around governance, is around education, is around health, is around welfare. What the Chinese were able to deliver in terms of global development was infrastructure. And so maybe there's some complementarity there if they could have worked together. But it was, there was no collaboration in those efforts. I'm not even suggesting there was, but from a conceptual framework, so how, it was that a kind of, is that a helpful, historical reference to make at this point, or is it, so damaging because both have sort of derailed in various ways and had unintended consequences and that kind of thing that, we need to scrap it and start again?
No, I think that is a very valuable reference point, and there were limited forms of real cooperation around. For example, the U.S. and China contributed to building the African CDC. They worked together in getting the Ebola outbreak in the mid 2010s under control. There is this history that now has been completely forgotten in Washington, where what you're pointing to looked like a viable direction, and then the geopolitical tensions just overwhelmed it. But I don't think that that complementarity is gone. Actually, it's changing and it may be eroding. And I think that the further the U.S. and China split their systems, the harder it will be to return to those sorts of mutually beneficial kind of complementary contributions. But it really is still there. Like, for example, the United States, after it started to perceive Chinese development lending as a serious threat, it has proposed a series of infrastructure building projects that would like win over the global South for the American side. And they just haven't amounted to anything because it's not in line with American political economy. We don't have the construction companies that can do this as cheaply as China does. We don't have the desire to win over the global South. The focus of American diplomacy has always been the allies who are much richer and more developed, particularly the formal treaty allies, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, NATO. So those projects never amounted to much. It's not something that the United States, I think, is going to be very effective at doing. But something that the United States in the past has been very effective at doing, as you say, is working on governance systems, working on how to integrate these things into communities. This is something that China is very bad at least up to this point. China's making efforts and getting better on some of these things. But China has been much more comfortable dealing with governments rather than with communities, has been much more comfortable coming in and clearing the land and building the port, building the railroad, rather than thinking about how this connects in with a complex society, complex ecosystem. These are things that the United States really has things to offer. And despite the best efforts of current leadership to destroy those systems, I think they will be quite resilient. That the United States will still be able to offer these things if we came back with a different orientation towards the world and a different understanding of how American leadership could show up in the world.
So Jake, since you have been, opened the door for me to put my historian's hat on, I'm going to keep going down that path. So in the, history of U.S.-China relations, there have been, moments where coalitions in the United States have come together in powerful ways to shape U.S. policy towards China, whether that's the open door constituency in the late 19th century of, missionaries and traders who had reason to find common cause to, encourage the United States to pursue a policy of open door activity in China. Whether that's the China lobby in the 1940s and 50s, who came in very strongly in support of the United States continuing its relationship with Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic of China and Taiwan. What's the constituency today for human rights? Is there a coalescing that you could see of communities that would advocate for a robust human rights policy as the United States emerges China, and in particular as President Trump prepares to go there in April?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, as I indicated, I think the old approach to human rights is disintegrating. And I think the space for the kind of we opened the webinar with this framing that we would have been talking about China and human rights for several decades. There was just a very sort of standardized format framing for talking about human rights in China. And all of that has just been blown up. It's been blown up by developments in China. It's been blown up by developments in the United States. Obviously, the United States no longer has any standing to come and talk to China about human rights. To the extent that it did before. All of that is gone. The United States government the current government has no interest in talking about human rights. So I think for me, the challenge is how do we find ourselves to a new way of understanding human rights, one that fits the needs of the new historical moment. Right. The reason that the old approach to human rights made sense is that it was a negative approach to rights. It was a classically liberal approach to rights. Limited state tyranny over the individual. And we're moving towards a different format of organizing our societies. It's not about individuals interacting through a market and the state comes in only when necessary. This is going to be a much more state-forward world. And the only question, I think, is that state going to be organizing the people on behalf of international conflict and in order to exclude those who are defined as foreign? Or is the state going to be organizing an inclusive society that meets the needs of regular people in a substantive way? So that means making sure that people have access to basic needs, not just making sure that they have access to be able to write a letter to the editor or to be able to vote. Because part of the reason that the old system has fallen apart, has been discredited, is that the freedom of speech and freedom of the vote, it turns out it didn't guarantee people's basic needs. They were victimized by massive inequality. They were victimized by corrupt elites. People recognize that, and that is why democracy and human rights, the old approach to those things, has lost its grounding. I think for those of us who really care about these things, we need to find a different approach to them that has to be based not on these negative rights, but on positive rights, on a substantive conception of democracy and human rights, political inclusion, as well as internationalism.
So maybe what you're saying is that there needs to be a fundamental shift in the domestic polity before there is an articulation of a policy around human rights globally. Or
I think there will be a dialogue between those two, and that if we manage to save these traditions by recreating them, it will be something that happens through foreign policy as well as domestic policy. I don't think those things at this level, when the world is going through this kind of a historical shift, I don't think those things can be separated very cleanly.
Elizabeth, what about you? Do you see a coalition coming together in support of, thinking about rights and values and U.S. policy toward China?
I mean, I don't see it coming together. It's always been there. And I want to push back a little bit on what Jake was saying. I wouldn't say that the former international world order regarding human rights was, it failed because it was focused on sort of negative aspect. We have to really recognize the attacks by the state on the human rights community, in particular, if we're looking at the People's Republic of China, but even in the United States. But in China, and Carl has touched upon this slightly in some of the things that he was talking about, there was a concerted effort for the last several decades, if not, all of PRC modern history, to stifle these dissenting voices or voices of human rights defenders. We saw it in the crackdown on the human rights defender lawyers in 2015. We saw it again the next year when the crackdown on the Feminist Five on International Women's Day. So they have been facing considerable headwinds for decades now, and that they've been able to continue to flourish and operate under the radar, I think is really commendable. And we have to recognize that is happening in the PRC. But now even in the diaspora communities, they're being attacked by foreign interference and transnational repression, lack of support from their host governments, as well as the removal of this sort of human rights rhetoric. These individuals are facing personal and existential crises on their own, but Amy, to your point, they're still there. They're just trying to find and navigate this time in history about who cares about these issues. We're seeing it in all of these kind of middle powers focus on economic security, and again, with human rights taking a back seat. So where I agree with Jake is we need to find new ways to be pushing these narratives forward. But that's what the human rights community does best. They work together. And we've seen that in China, and we see that in the United States and in other countries as well. So it's not always about negative rights, about, getting the state out of our freedom of expression. In other countries, even in Canada, that's not how human rights are conceptualized. And I think that's something we need to reckon with here in the United States.
So I appreciate that, Elizabeth, taking it sort of back to the human level, right? Taking it back to the people. I guess I would ask, as we're, thinking about a presidential trip to China, that was often a time when people, literally individual people, became central in the state-to-state discussion, particularly around, anybody, political prisoners in China, groups in China that, there was an interest in seeing, maybe elevated or supported. Do you think there's any capacity for that in the pre-meeting discussions that will be taking place? Any calls for releases of political prisoners? Any calls for action? For policy or legislative changes that will benefit people in China?
I mean, I'm not an expert at the federal level governance in the United States. But I do know that for ongoing efforts taking place right now, it's very difficult. And we can already kind of see this in the most public exposure of this is on the Jimmy Lai case. President Trump did sort of backtrack his efforts in pushing for Jimmy Lai's release or a reduction in his sentencing. We know that this was raised in other high-level delegation visits that have placed recently between other countries in the People's Republic of China. Whether or not that's going to have any effect is a different story, as we see, a rising confidence in the PRC in what it can and cannot do within its own borders and how to withstand sort of international pressure on this, especially when it's coming from the United States right now. My personal opinion is that it's highly unlikely that this will be the topic in any sort of negotiations in the upcoming summit, simply because the focus is very much on economics and soybeans and what have you.
Carl, how about you? Anything you'd like to see in terms of specific calls around rule of law and human rights?
I mean, I think, to sort of echo something that I think, both Jake and Elizabeth mentioned, I mean, I do think your domestic stuff is kind of hard to separate out from from the foreign side of things. If you're the commitment to transparency, if you're looking for something hopeful, I think it's that as all of these countries slide back towards something that looks a little closer to single man rule, you do kind of run into the same kinds of classic problems about power, how to constrain it, and maybe in each of these countries, as people begin to grapple with these very basic questions, they kind of share. There's a shared sense of we've got to be able to do better than this. So, I mean, what you're pointing to me is you're sort of asking me, well, what could governments do that would notably advance X, Y, or Z? But I do run into a core problem, which is if it's two monarchs talking to each other, what is that? How does that advance things? I mean, things will shift around. Something will be moved one way or the other, and perhaps Jamila gets freed, or and that would be good. But I do think there's a deeper question rather than what are the two governments doing, what are the two leaders of the countries themselves doing, and that really goes to sort of like what are the systems that each country is building in itself. And you would want, if you're really thinking about how you would want each country, whether it's China, Russia, or the United States, you'd really want to see organic evolution within the society itself as citizens, as officials begin to grapple with some of these core issues. And, frankly, at the moment, the United States has got a whole bunch of problems itself. China has even more. And I do think that, this is something, over decades, hopefully we'll be sharing experiences, not just among the leaders themselves, but among individuals about how do you actually begin to improve your and my respective systems.
Elizabeth, this was something you mentioned in your paper. I can't remember the exact way you phrased it, but you in your conclusion, you say, this has to be a comprehensive strategy, right? It's not something specifically targeted at China. It's really, but you were talking about in terms of transnational repression at the subnational level, right? It's got to be something that's thought about holistically. So I take that as a good point, Carl, that and maybe that's where the international human rights movement is right now, right? That it's something that has to be kind of taken in its entirety because there's maybe not enough momentum to address things bilaterally. We have one question from the audience, which I want to get to, and it's, what do panelists say to those who are in the United States who are frustrated with how our government is ignoring issues such as climate change, and see the Chinese government's approach as relatively more environmentally friendly, and therefore view any criticism of China's human rights or labor practices as something we in the United States should not engage in, as the U.S. is arguably as bad in that regard? I guess this is kind of, a good follow-up to the conversation we were just having, right? Sort of what about the whataboutism?
I'm perfectly happy being a weatherman who says there's a hurricane and there's a tornado and they're both not good. Saying that, that I don't understand this whole concept that because hurricanes are bad, you must say tornadoes are good. I mean, no, you can talk about, reasonable people can sort of be like, there's issues here, there's issues there, and I'll talk about both of them.
The way that I like to approach it is to say you can't, just look at everything that the PRC does, like Carl was saying, and say that it's bad. One of the examples that you can look at is as a lawyer by training, I apologize, I am going to go that route. The personal information protection law that the PRC came out with, there's a lot of provisions in that piece of legislation that fill some holes that people had identified in the GDPR. That's wonderful, that's great, but you can't just take it at face value. You have to look at the system within which that law is going to be operating. And as Carl touched upon, or Amy, I think it was you, it's not a rule of law system. And so, well, those provisions in the law in China might be something you want to consider in a rule of law system. The way that they're going to be applied in a one-party state is going to be entirely different, and it might not be good. So it's really getting back to this idea of you need to understand the nuances of the PRC and what it's doing might work in certain ways and how it's affecting its communities in good or bad ways, as Carl alluded to, and then what might we learn from that? And a lot of my human rights work and capacity building work was about that lessons sharing between countries, including people from the PRC. What can we learn from their experiences? And what can we draw from that and put it in our own context? And what are our shared sense of grievances and shared challenges? Because at the people level, if we're talking about climate change in particular, very similar. You look at Flint, Michigan, and you look at pollution and waterways in the PRC, very similar challenges. Why aren't we talking about that at the people-to-people level?
And just to build on that, I mean, I totally think also, yeah, you know, if there's something positive that's being done, you give credit to that. I mean, there's no reason why, right? You can say if you're an objective, you know, assessor of what's taking place, you say what is good, and then you say what is problematic, and you do it. It doesn't matter which system it is, you're dealing with all of them.
I also
I
think
think
there's something implied in the questioner's question about, you know, whether the problem of sort of prioritization of certain rights over others, right? I mean, he's suggesting that, you know, people are critical, you know, pulling back on critiquing labor standards or other human rights violations because they might come at the expense of environmental progress. Jake, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I think so. Just in line with what Elizabeth and Carl were saying, the starting point of that question is thinking about things in terms of China versus the United States. And is China doing something wrong from the standpoint of the United States? Like, how can the United States lecture China? I think there's actually a really damaging outcome of that kind of a framing, which is that the United States diplomatically, right, at an official level. I'm not talking about American academics and everyday citizens who should be as critical and clear-eyed about this as possible. But at a diplomatic level, it's quite clear that when the United States employs human rights criticism, it does so on behalf of a geopolitical agenda. Because the United States consistently supports dictatorships around the world. It supports mass killings and human rights violations in wars, atrocities, crimes against humanity. All of these things are a consistent record of the United States in recent years. And when do the human rights criticisms come up? It comes up when we're talking to rivals. It comes up when we're talking about China and Iran and North Korea. It doesn't come up when we're talking about Israel. It doesn't come up when we're talking about Saudi Arabia. It doesn't come up when we're talking about Colombia, right? Until recently, but then it's obviously not on the basis of human rights. So it's like cynical instrumentalization of human rights to a geopolitical agenda that does real damage to human rights as a concept. Because people I completely agree, Elizabeth, about about the heroic efforts of human rights defenders in China. But those people are a very small number of Chinese people. And most Chinese people are not engaged in these struggles. And in fact, when it comes to the question of human rights, there's an internal debate. Is the government of China protecting the people, and does it have to suppress those demanding a more just and equal society in order to protect the people of China? When the United States instrumentalizes human rights to a geopolitical agenda, one that is obviously about damaging China's ability to develop, damaging China's quest for international status, that's quite clear to the people of China. And they become very cynical about the idea of human rights too. And often they start to associate human rights as something Western. Right?
Elizabeth,
Like
I
this
want
is
to give you a chance to respond if you want.
No, I agree, Jake, but I think that we also have to contextualize this in the form of information suppression and manipulation that's taking place not only in the PRC, which has the most effective censorship tool in the world. I mean, I think we've effectively proven that you can nail Jell-O to the wall. But we're also seeing that, and that's sort of the big crux of my paper, is the information distortion and manipulation that we're seeing that's being perpetrated by the PRC, its proxies, as well as other adversarial governments, is manipulating the information that we're seeing to be able to critically assess whether or not those things are happening. So whether or not individuals in the PRC want or don't want human rights as conceptualized by Western notions, if you want to put it that way, is unknowable, not only because information has been manipulated, but because people are having a chilling effect. And that extends beyond the small community of human rights defenders that you and I have just been talking about. That chilling effect does percolate around the broader community, and it comes here into diaspora communities in the United States, Canada, Australia as well, and that's very well documented.
We have, I think, 60 seconds left. I would invite the Penn Project to continue this conversation, and it's a really fascinating one with sort of the question of, you know, does the United States having a human rights policy towards China matter? You know, fundamentally, is it, you know, what does it come from and what is it able to achieve? And so, that could be our continuing conversation. I'm going to invite our panelists in the, seconds we have remaining. One article or book on China that you have read recently or want to read that you want to recommend to this larger audience we have that's been stimulating for you. Quick lightning round. Carl.
Actually, off the top of my head, I'm just going to say the book that I just downloaded, and it's not about China. It's about Japan alone. It's about a society sort of talking about modern Japan, increasing isolation in society.
All right, Elizabeth.
Beijing Rules by Bethany Allen and China Unbound by Joanna Tu. I'm sorry for two, but those are really great ones if you want to understand foreign interference and economic coercion.
All right, Jake.
I would recommend there's a new book out by Kevin Gallagher and Gregory Chin that looks at China's integration into the global development institutions and sort of what China brings that's unique, the ways in which China challenges those existing institutions. And referring back to the question about is there potential on the Chinese side for what I'm talking about here, that's a great book for getting a sense of where that potential is and what the limits are right now.
All right. And with that, I will invite our host and the director of the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations to come back on camera and close us out.
Thank you, Amy. And wow, that was a really, really provocative and stimulating discussion. Thank you, Amy, for masterfully moderating all of these different perspectives. And I hope if anyone had any doubt that the Penn Project does not put a thumb on the scale in terms of viewpoints. We embrace a really wide range of viewpoints as long as people are coming to the discussion with the level of thoughtfulness and expertise that our three fellows and panelists in this webinar brought today. That's what makes me happy, what makes us happy, what is the lifeblood of this project. So thank you all for really, really a wonderful conversation. And absolutely, as Amy said, we should continue it, including with the further development of your respective papers and the final publication, but hopefully beyond that as well. And thank you to the great audience that was here on Zoom. I saw many friends in the list of participants, and also those who are watching this either live or later on YouTube. And again, we're in the middle of this 6-week cycle. Stay tuned next week for another rollout of one of our other thematic groups, again, all the way through the end of March. Thank you again. See you next week.